Hey guys, welcome to Tutorial 1. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to paint realistic eyes in Photoshop. Alright, so before we even begin, I want to go over some fundamentals of using your tablet and painting in Photoshop. So ideally before starting, you should be somewhat familiar with your tablet and your painting software. Starting out with tablet functionality, this is most applicable if you're using a Wacom tablet, but I think most current tablets should have a similar user interface. Before you start, make sure your tablet driver is installed and up to date. You can check this in the Desktop Center, which can be found within your Wacom program files. Additionally, more functionality settings can be found in the Properties window for your tablet. I'll pull up this window quite often, especially if I need to change my hotkeys or recalibrate the tablet. And as you can see here, there's a tab for the hotkeys or express keys, and so on for whatever you may feel like you want to customize on your tablet, which of course is all entirely optional. It's just there to assist with your workflow. Another important feature is the tablet preference file utility window. Now this here is going to let you reset your pressure sensitivity, and I personally will use this each time before I use my tablet. Alright, so finally we're going to open Photoshop, and first I just want to bring your attention to the Workspace configuration I'm using. This is a pretty standard configuration. You can always edit, and I just want to explain to you the windows that I find most important while I'm painting. Okay, now obviously over on the left we have our tool window, which is pretty important no matter what you're doing in Photoshop. And then I've also got the navigator, history, and layers palette showing right now on the right side. And then behind the navigator window is the swatches panel where you can set your color palettes. And the navigator window is used to zoom in and out of your canvas. And then your brush presets will show you how each of your brushes will show up with pressure sensitivity. And obviously the layers window is quite important to display your layers and add new layers and such. And then you've got your brush settings window where you can customize all your brush settings. Now, if you do prefer to edit your Photoshop workspace, you can simply go to Window, Workspace, and select a workspace preset, or you can scroll down and open whichever particular window you'd like. So we've got brush presets, layers, the navigator, the tools, etc. Now there are a lot of different ways to modify your brush. If you right click, there's the slider for size, as well as a selection of brushes, and then obviously there's the brush preset window and the brush settings window. In the brush settings window, there are a ton of options to get different effects with a certain brush you're using. Right now, some of the presets that I have selected are shape dynamics, transfer, build-up, and smoothing. And last but not least, we have the opacity slider. I'll definitely be using that a lot today for this demo because this is a demo about painting with opacity. So I'll just show you quickly what opacity essentially does. It just adds transparency to your stroke. And then over to the right I have my color palette, as you can see. And then if we go down to the layers window, you can see that I have my palette on its own layer and my rough sketch on another layer. And finally, we can begin painting. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer to paint on so that I can preserve that sketch layer and not paint directly on it. Okay, and now to actually start painting, I'm going to hold down Alt with my brush selected to pick a color out of my palette, and then I'm going to go up to the opacity slider and pick an opacity that I feel is appropriate for simply blocking in those base tones. And lastly, I right click with my brush to access that brush size slider. Generally, I'll start with a large brush to block in those colors, just to get them all down. At this point, it is going to look quite messy, and that's perfectly normal. You just want to get all of those colors and all of those tones down as a base for you to paint on and blend. So don't worry about blending yet, that comes later. And do keep in mind that this recording is sped up by about 500%. So I'm not actually painting that fast, and please don't feel like you have to paint that fast. Everybody has their own workflow and their own speed that they like to go at, so it's all about your preferences. And obviously this is not the workflow you have to stick with. Once you do start painting and find out how you like to work, you'll develop your own workflow and a pace that you prefer to work at. And obviously as you become more experienced, your pace will become a bit quicker. Now, throughout my painting process, I will go ahead and adjust that opacity every now and then, as well as adjust the brush size. So once I've locked all those colors in, I like to reduce the brush size to give me a little bit more control over those finer lines and rendering out some of those details. But don't worry about rendering while you're still blocking in colors, because generally that will slow you down. You don't want to worry about the details yet, just get all of your color blocking done. And it's definitely worth mentioning that if you are unfamiliar with your subject or want to capture the likeness and anatomical accuracy, it's perfectly okay to use a reference. I often recommend it, and I'm simply not using a reference for this demo because I've painted eyes a few times, but using references will only help you, so always keep that in mind. Especially photo references, as those are the most accurate references you could use, even if you are painting in a semi-realistic style or you have that stylized type of art. As you can see, I'm slowly building up the shadows and the highlights on the skin. Shadows and highlights are critical for building form, which is why it's very important to understand your light source, where your light is coming from, and how the light interacts with the surface that you're painting. We will definitely be discussing this further in coming tutorials because it is critical no matter what you're painting to be aware of your light source. Now, once I get somewhat along in the painting process, I'll reduce my brush size quite a bit, and this is referred to as rendering, as I'm trying to capture those smaller details and somewhat outline those larger forms to make them pop. So that's what you're seeing right now, and that's the part of the process that I feel like brings your art to life because it adds that attention to detail. As you've probably been able to tell, I've been using undo or the Control-Z hotkey on my tablet quite frequently, which is just another part of the process. And I can tell you now you'll be using undo quite a bit as well, so do have that keyboard shortcut memorized, and that is Control-Z for undo. Another really important thing that I haven't mentioned yet is always remember to save. Save your work early and save your work frequently. Because although Photoshop doesn't crash as often as 3D applications, such as Maya or ZBrush, it will still crash on you from time to time. Now I know that probably seems like a no-brainer, but you'll be surprised how easy it is for that to slip your mind while you're working. So just remember, Control-S for save. Another thing that you can probably tell is that I've been creating new layers excessively while I've been painting, and that is just to keep things separate and organized, and it is a habit of mine. If you like, you can keep all your paint on one layer. It all depends how you prefer to work. Once I've created a certain amount of layers, I'll go ahead and make a new folder to put the layers inside. And that just saves me some time so I can keep them organized without naming them. Ideally, you would want to name all your layers just so you know what they are, but it's up to you. If you've been paying attention to the layers window, you'll notice that I have been adjusting two layer settings. Firstly, the opacity, and secondly, the blending mode, both of which are incredibly helpful in achieving the desired effect you want in your art. As with brush opacity, layer opacity changes the transparency of your layer. Layer blending modes, however, is much more of an in-depth subject. But essentially, changing the blending mode is just changing how your layer will blend with the layers beneath it. It's definitely worth doing some research on each blending mode and playing around with those to get different effects. Once I'm somewhat satisfied with the eye on the right side, I'm going to go ahead and start painting the eye on the left side. And I'll use the exact same process that I used for the first eye. And for the sake of time, we're just going to do a quick time lapse for that one. Now for the finishing touches, we're going to build up our highlights, render additional highlights, and do a bit more blending, as well as overlay some subtle colors. And there you have it. In just under an hour, you can paint realistic eyes with a high level of detail, using this blocking in, blending, and then rendering method. Thanks for watching, guys. And if you found this video demo helpful, be sure to check out Tutorial 2.